I thought we had someone from the state.
He's going to attempt to make it. He hasn't signed in as an attendee yet, but I did talk to him. So if he can't make it for some odd reason, we can definitely discuss what he was proposing, what the ideas he had.
Okay. Was it that section that you emailed around, the proposal from
Newcastle County.
Newcastle?
Yes.
Can you bring that up? Maybe we take a look at it.
Give me just a minute. Figure out where I saved that.
I'm curious as to what wave run up and reflection refer to, but I think I know.
And again, a lot of their, they don't really have any coastal AE zones like we do. They have a lot of floodway. So there is a difference between how you can treat that, because again, we have coastal AE zones and we don't have any floodway. So flooding occurs differently.
Yeah.
So let me share my screen.
Yeah, we don't have flash flooding like they do.
Right. Which I think can impact the way you treat fill in the floodplain.
Mm-hmm.
Can everybody see the Newcastle County Code?
Can you make it larger? The print
Yes.
larger?
Better.
All right. So made it a little bit larger, and it's going to be on 2 different screens. So and again, this was just something to think about and to get ideas about what we were talking about, because right now the conflict between the two is there are 2 different sections of code, and we just didn't pick up both about allowing fill in the floodplain and its overall impact. And I think the intent is no net zero impact. And how do we address that? And how do we get that the similar in this both sections of the code?
Right.
And maybe it's just as simple as fixing the other section of code to reference major subdivisions. I don't know. It was just something that popped in my head. It's because we had a really long discussion about it at the last meeting, and I think, I think there's some word tweaking we need to do to the proposed code that we've got, because of just the wording that they had flagged, and then the issue with the consistency with the other section of code. So if we just make it all just straight across the board, that applies to major subdivisions, so an individual can continue to bring in that fill to grade their site, and that doesn't impact because you can't bring in fill to for structure purposes, but you can bring in fill to grade and to do a few other things.
Right.
If you take a drive out New Road and turn left on Old Orchard Road, just before you get to the bike trail, there's a contractor working there on a multi-use development, and the grading has risen about 4 feet overnight, I think, along. It's set back from Old Orchard, but it looks like the site is being raised, and it's not in the floodplain. It's way far away from the floodplain, so he's just basically stabilizing or raising his site.
Well, and he's probably doing some of that for grading, for stormwater management purposes, because sometimes you bring in fill just so you can grade to get to, so you can drain into your stormwater management facilities, and you can get it all to go into the one to the right direction.
Some of it may also be excavated material for stormwater management.
Correct. Yeah. A lot of people try, it's like we dig out for stormwater management and we try to use that other places just to grade the site. So it's like we also have to remember that when we're talking about fill, some of it is actually needed just to grade the site so it drains properly, because we all know there are drainage problems in the city, and if we don't allow for grading for drainage, then are we then complicating the situation?
Yeah, the term natural drainage is sort of a, I don't think there is any down here.
Okay, so it's very similar. This text is very similar to ours, actually.
Yeah, I think if we're going to take something from theirs, I think we just need to take, because I think that the intent is that is this. I think that's really what you want the code to say, correct?
Right. And then number 2, now we haven't added a restriction or modification of compensatory storage shall be provided on deed restrictions encumbering the property. Now we don't have that. I don't know that we need it. I would wonder why they put that in.
So that's more for floodway, because conveyance system basically references creeks, streams, rivers,
Right.
that sort of thing that are covering thousands of acres. Whereas we're much more micro, where you might have a sub watershed of 10 acres going to a ditch.
Right.
And that's all going to be on the same property. So the conveyance system doesn't go across necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But that's floodway, riverine type verbiage.
So I just want to make sure number 2 really, from the engineering perspective, Brent, really is for floodways and really doesn't make sense for the city where we just have coastal flood zones.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the first sentence I think is important.
So again, that's for floodway where water is moving downhill, so that if you were to put an obstacle in the way, then it's going to get displaced while it's rushing down the river to get away. What we're having is it's coming in at us, and not necessarily, it's a tide driven flooding as much as anything else.
Well, I still think the first sentence is what we say in what we've proposed, that if you do fill in the floodplain, then you have to provide compensatory storage.
But so that's the issue, is that there really isn't compensatory storage for the Atlantic Ocean.
Well, how about the marsh? I mean, that's really what we're probably most concerned about, is the marsh, not the ocean.
So the flooding is when everything comes in. So it's rising, it's not rushing.
Right.
So there's not really a storage.
Well, if you fill the floodplain, aren't you losing storage?
Technically, no, because the Delaware Bay is the Delaware Bay, the Atlantic Ocean is the Atlantic Ocean.
But again, we're looking at the marsh. I mean, we
in a
had that
flooding situation-
AECOM study that clearly said that several of the subdivisions that occurred in the area were raising the level of the marsh in the floodplain. And that was because there was a lot of floodplain fill.
Which goes back to the bathtub scenario of limiting.
It sort of disproves the bathtub scenario. It's saying that we
No, it
are
absolutely
having
proves it, because there's a limited finite amount of water and a limited amount of area. It's putting a brick in the bathtub. And we don't have a bathtub. We have the Delaware Bay that's connected to the canal and the back marshes.
Well,
That's why coastal is regulated differently than floodplains, and floodways are different.
I agree. I am not concerned with flooding from the bay and flooding from the ocean. I'm concerned with what's happening inland.
Which is connected to the bay.
Yes, definitely.
Right. So like Newcastle County, they've got the rivers coming through. So when the rain hits, it's impacting how the river flows. And then if they can take some of that storage from the rivers, that they need to address that. Our problem is we're more like the swimming pool. It's coming at us all at once from our massive water bodies. So there isn't really somewhere to move the water. I think, did I get that right, kind of, Brent?
Yeah.
And I think what we want to do is, and I think, you know, what Brent is saying is there's no way to hold that water. That water, because it's tidal, is just going to come. But with other, I think with other like BMPs and dealing with stormwater management, which are not flooding issues, but they help with the stormwater management, there's ways to address that. But I think what you want to do is really what number 1 says is, okay, you can fill, but there's no net loss of floodplain storage. So if you do this, you're still at that no net loss. Because we recognize, because I think more up north, what this has is they're more like the bathtub, and we're more the swimming pool, because of just the water, the differences in the where the water is and how the water functions.
How do you prove no net loss unless you show compensatory storage?
So I don't think you need compensatory storage to show no net loss. I think there's engineering that can be done to show that, okay, and again, I'm not the engineer, which is why we have Brent, is that you can do the math to show, okay, this is what the floodplain storage was. And with this development, even with the fill, we are at 0.
Well, if you fill though, you've got to replace. And that's the compensatory storage.
So there's a lot of here and there with that. Is almost every site isn't going to be able to be constructed at that point. And the way the flooding is connected is the water is rising and it's finding an elevation. So whatever elevation's out in the bay is whatever elevation is going to be in the back bay and the back canal and the back marshes. If I'm taking away 30 cubic yards of that, it's not going to offset anything, because the water from the bay is still going to find its still water elevation. So if the water comes up to 6, it's going to be 6 at all the properties, period. So the compensatory storage is, it's more for the riverine effect when it's flowing downhill. So you're not just filling and filling and filling and putting obstacles in the way. And that's when it actually builds up when it goes around and affects the neighbors in a higher manner, because the water's higher and it moves quicker. Think of being around bridge pilings when the tide's moving through. It's that sort of thought process because it's such a confined area. What we're up against is just so much water.
Well, let's hope that the guy from the state joins us.
Again, even when I had a conversation with him, he was like, you know, and he made he did let me know that there was a difference between their code, because they are riverine and floodways, and the coastal A. And I think you know, because when I talked to him, he was like, you know, what they've done really good is the no net loss, which I think is what we were talking about. Because again, that like Brent says, the compensatory storage really goes into, you know, your riverine and your floodway issues, which function
This is-
differently.
Yeah, and this is also going to affect how basically how things are looked at with, you know, the freeboard that we have, the 18 inches above base flood elevation. It's going to render a lot of almost every site unbuildable or undevelopable. So there's a subdivision just outside of town, is just outside of the floodway that was recently constructed. Visually, you can tell it came up a little bit for the road, but not like 4 or 5 feet crazy. It was constructed in a manner that the houses are going to drain, which it's required to do under the building code for the first 10 feet. They're going to capture all the stormwater, keep it on site. They didn't take a single load of dirt off the site. They used what they used or dug out of the stormwater ponds for general grading, and then also brought in over 8,000 yards of dirt to make the subdivision work, to make the road elevated, to make it drain, to make the buildings drain, all of that. You're talking, it's not a very big site. It's something like 20 acres, and they brought in 8,000 yards of dirt. So in the compensatory storage, it's out of balance. But that property, if it were in the floodplain, wouldn't have any effect on the neighbor's property.
Okay, well, let's go on with these issues here,
So number 3 we already have, because
already
that's
have.
already in our code.
right?
I think number 4 we kind of have already, and Brent, and then I know Robin's on the call, so he can verify that is. That, I mean, because we do have requirements for individual houses and
Right.
that you can fill.
Here we go.
Yeah. And then the fill placed for purposes of other than, because again, our code says you can't, if I'm,
Right.
give me just a minute. I'm going to stop sharing for 1 minute so I'm going to bring Robin on board if he can help me, because he is the floodplain expert for the city. And then Brent is, of course, a certified floodplain manager as well. So that's why we've got them on board to answer some of the floodplain questions to help us address. Yeah, because number 6 from Newcastle County is just any filling in the FEMA floodplain in conflict. You just need to get, you just can't violate FEMA, but you just need to get a letter.
But they will sometimes give you permission to fill.
They will. I think they
Jump
don't
through the
give
hoops.
permission in the VE zone
Right, you
Or-
can't fill in the V zone.
for any purposes.
Right.
But the AE, they do allow fill for drainage purposes, but not for the.
The Limois is a new thing. So they're starting to treat the Limois zone, which is the area where wave runup is. So the thought is that the water is deep enough that you're still going to have waves, and the wave energy is where the damage occurs. So the V zone is the extreme by the water. The Limois backs behind that, and then the AE zone is back behind that.
Did you say that Robin was going to join us?
Yep, I've promoted him. He might actually be on a call because I know he was going to try and multitask this morning. Because we are all incredibly busy. So I think it comes down to is, I think we like the number one, the no proposal to fill shall result in a net loss floodplain storage of the subject parcels. But it's, Melanie, you want something else, some added protection is what I'm getting. Is if we're not allowing a net loss, you want either it looks like you're looking for extra protection, or are you just looking for some type of study and report showing that there is no net loss?
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. And it seemed to me that the compensatory storage was the vehicle for that.
Okay. Brent, since the compensatory storage is really more towards floodways and riverines, is there a report or something that can be done to show the no net loss that would address the concerns Melanie is having? If it's not the compensatory storage item, or is it just the data that the engineer is going to submit to us and of course get reviewed by engineers in the conservation district?
So that begs the question of what is the standard of the application, so that everybody's playing the same game, so to speak, that XYZ engineers and ABC engineers are submitting the same information to be reviewed in the same manner.
Right.
There really isn't necessarily ground rules for that at this time. The standard, I think what is already in there, it says, in general, you cannot affect the neighbor's property. But you're allowed to, quote unquote, affect the flooding elevation slightly, which then turns into the lawyer discussion of what is flooding and what is nuisance, what is flooding, what is an insurable act, what is, good neighbor, bad neighbor, what actually does that entail? If the base flood elevation is 8 and the elevation gets to 7, are you affecting your neighbor? Is your neighbor just generally affected anyway because the elevation's at 7 across the city? If there's 100 properties and 99 of them are going to be affected anyway, and one of them was the last one built, did they affect all 99? Not really. The elevation's the elevation, because the flood's the flood. But is that a flood in FEMA's definition? Is that a flood in the lawyer's definition? Is that a flood in the homeowner's definition?
So
there's a difference between water damage and flooding when you ask an insurance person. But most lay people are like, I was flooded out, is just the general term that they use.
And I think what Melanie wants to make sure is that if I get flooded out, it's not because my neighbor added all that fill. So I'm gonna ask just another question. So when an engineer needs to prove no net loss of flood storage,
so in the floodway, you can write to FEMA and they will give you a model of the area that you can run, and run the model with the new fill in it in the floodway, because they have a program for that. I don't believe they have a program for that for floodplain areas.
Well, I don't understand why it's such a difficult computation.
Is it because
if you're filling, you can give a length, a width, a depth to that amount of fill and get up and compute a capacity. And you can do the same thing to compensate for that by removing material elsewhere and say, okay, I've removed 100 cubic feet here, and I'm going to compensate it by removing 100 cubic feet over here. You know, what is so difficult about it?
That's very simple and that's very
Yeah.
basic, but that's not how the flooding is affected.
So I have a question. Is if we just require, because every site's different, every site's unique, nothing's really the same in Lewis. If we just ask them to provide the documentation showing how they got to know net loss, does that solve your concern, Melanie, or is there something additional you want? With the understanding, like Brent said, is that sometimes there's no set way because of where the flooding might be, what the base flood elevation is that your calculations can be different based on, so like if I do a no net less for my property, it can be completely different the way it's calculated because of the properties of the property for like Brent's property. Is that kind of what you're looking for? I'm just trying to make sure I'm trying to get out. I think what I'm hearing is you just want some documentation showing how you're getting to the no net loss to verify there is no net loss, to try and ensure a minimal impact on neighboring properties.
No, I want no impact on, not minimal impact. I want no impact on adjoining properties.
Well, so right now, I know I'm gonna bring up stormwater management, but like if the way my property is already impacted, the code says that when somebody else comes in and builds next door to me, they can't make my property worse.
Right.
Because my property already existed. So if my property is already flooding, my neighbor, I'm still going to flood, but my neighbor can't make it worse. Because they're doing what they're required to do for all other rules and regulations. So my property is still going to flood because my property has always just flooded. But what my neighbor can't do is make my flooding worse.
Right, exactly. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
We agree on that.
Okay. Because that's already in code. That is
that's in there.
That's in state code that says my neighbor, when they build, if my property floods, my property can continue to flood. What they can't do is make my property flood more.
Well, isn't that contradicted by the Corps allowing someone to do a study and say, well, you know, byfill is only going to affect the floodplain by 2 inches. And the Corps says, fine, they give them a permit, and then we approve the plan. Well, you know, when 5 properties or 10 properties get that kind of approval, the floodplain's going to change.
So the floodplain is changing anyway, just because of the environment, because of climate change, because of storms, because of intensity of rains.
Agreed.
So because somebody is developing their property doesn't mean that that's the cause effect of the
increased flooding impact happening on my property. So I'm just going to use Brent and me as an example. It's like my house, my yard floods. Brent builds a new house. I now start seeing more flooding. It may not actually be because of his house. It's probably because of sea level rise, the increase in the water table, and the fact that it rains a lot more and we have more serious storm effects, rain events. But my gut reaction is to blame him because it didn't happen until he moved in. And I think what Melanie's trying to do is, how do we prove that just because, to ensure that I can't come back and go, Brent, you've just flooded my house, it's your fault that I have more flooding now, is there's some type of documentation showing Brent building his house is not the reason I have more flooding. Because it will happen, is like, you know, I might see more flooding because he builds his house, but it has nothing to do with the fact that he built a house. It's, you know, a bunch of other issues going on. And am I getting to it?
Well, I understand that, but I think that, you know, the problem we're having is there doesn't seem to be an easy engineering program that the engineer can go to and say, okay, here I am proving no net loss. You know, I'm filling 2,000 cubic yards of floodplain, but there's no net loss of floodplain storage. There is no program that proves that. Is that right, Brent?
Yeah, because in theory, there's not a net loss because, like I said,
Well, was the AECOM study wrong then?
no. So in order to do a study, you have to define boundaries because there's not a computer big enough. Even when FEMA runs models, they eat the elephant in bites. So everything that they do in Delaware is pared down, and they haven't gotten to a point where they can run, 10,000 miles of coastline all in the same model. So they kind of pare it down and parse things together. If you look at the flood insurance study, is probably 500 pages total in 3 different volumes. And for the Delaware shoreline, or actually, no, I think that's just Sussex County. And that's FEMA running a national program. So when we do flood studies, again, there's a finite boundary. So I have to draw it somewhere, and I have to have the computer to be able to function with it and operate and put the information in. So if I'm doing the whole city of Lewis, there's a good probably 6 months of data entry just to run it. If I've got enough LiDAR data, I can run a bathtub. I can put the boundaries in and see how it operates. So technically, it's not wrong. You're looking at it here. Every little bit, it kind of affects this and that. But again, the model is a model, and it doesn't really show what happens in real life.
So the model's going to tell us.
It doesn't have the rain. It doesn't have the quick tide. It doesn't have the wind push. It has, my water elevation is this and the water's coming up, but it doesn't have the back pressure. It doesn't have, I got 4 inches of rain last hour and it's coming at me and everything. It serves the purpose to know where you are and understand that you're attempting to be a good neighbor, but it has its limitations. You're running it on, one storm scenario or one tide scenario that, we ran models for West Cedar Street on Zeta and looked at, how it came up and how it affected West Cedar Street and a couple of the little side streets. And we have pictures from the storm event of areas that had water that our model didn't show. So again, we had to draw boundaries and limits for where water was and where we thought it was and when it came in and when it comes up the canal and how it affected things. But we got pictures that actually showed more effect. And this is, October last year. So we got real pictures that showed 2 inches of water sitting on the road, and in our model, the road didn't have any water on it.
So to me, it sounds like there's a model that can show no net loss, but like anything in life, it's not a guarantee, is what I'm hearing. But we will get data to show that based on the models that have been run, there is no net loss. But again, there's no guarantee in life. I can only guarantee two things in this world, and neither of them are anything environmental. One, I'm going to be paying taxes, and at some point I'm going to die. So that's the only two things I can guarantee. But it sounds like as we continue to use the model and get more information, and as we continue to gather information, it sounds like the models hopefully will get better and better over time, just like anything. The more information we get, and I think especially with the last couple of years with the
Yeah, I mean,
crazy storms
the-
events,
This is a prime example of models getting better.
right?
You know, this
And
used
they
to take $10,000 in a room full of processors. Now it's right here.
Yeah. So I think it sounds like if we change the code to say no net loss, but you got to provide us the data of how you got there, with the understanding that, like everything, it is based on the most it's based on the current data and the best information possible, that it's showing that. Are we comfortable with that and tweaking that in the code?
I have a question for Brent. How expensive, engineering-wise, calculation-wise, would it be for a homeowner to get that type of information from an engineering firm? Is it going to force the common Joe to,
But it
Take
doesn't
out a-
apply to, it only applies to subdivisions, Joe. It doesn't
Okay.
apply to homeowner.
okay, well, based on a
It'll-
subdivision,
It'll get baked into the subdivision design. You're not talking a lot of money, maybe $5,000 to $7,000.
extra.
Yeah,
Okay. I'm just wondering what the.
potentially, depending on how difficult people make their own lives.
Okay.
Sometimes people make their own lives difficult. So.
All right, it all blends in. All right, thank you.
Okay, let me propose a scenario, and maybe that will help me understand this better. Say someone comes along to do a subdivision, and they have to cross a part of the marsh to get to the land to being subdivided. So they're going to fill some floodplain with their road. And then they do the subdivision, nothing else is affected. How do they prove that filling the road in the floodplain has no net impact on the storage capacity of the floodplain?
So for that one, that would be pretty much a DENREC review, and you're going to have to show hydrology. So you're either going to have what I call an elevated causeway type, where there's free flow underneath, enough culverts to show that there's equalization on each side and it doesn't affect. So if you've got 100 feet from A to B and you're creating the dumbbell or barbell in between, and you just straight fill it as a causeway with nothing, to allow for free flow, and it has to go over top, that's not going to be allowed to be done. What you're going to have to do is have enough points through there to keep the marsh healthy, to keep the water flow, hydrology on each side okay, and not have it impounded and backed up on the backside of that for when the tide comes in and then wants to go back out, that it doesn't lag behind.
Okay, so there could be a study done that shows that the floodplain absolutely has no impact, even though they're filling it.
Yes, that it, I wouldn't say no impact, but minimal impact, and that you're not greatly altering it.
Okay, so that still bothers me.
So let me propose a question on the other side. If we want to become a resilient community and we're building homes, then we need to go upward. We saw this week the instance in Louisiana where people had 4 feet of water everywhere, and it wasn't even to the 1% flood elevation. So again, according to FEMA, is it a flood? Is it not a flood? According to lawyers, yes, it is. But according to FEMA, it didn't hit the 1% flood elevation. But you've got 4 feet of water on the roads, in the houses. Fire trucks can't get there. Ambulances can't get there. Police can't get there. You're just recreating that situation. Putting more people in that negative living space. Now, to go back to the causeway idea, is it might cost them some money, and you're going to build a causeway, and you're putting pilings out there, building a bridge, and water's going to flow around it when the tide comes back. As far as the flood elevation, the base flood elevation of 8, it's not going to alter that at all. What it's going to alter is every Tuesday when the tide comes in and tide goes back out, that's what's going to be affected. So that's not really a FEMA thing. That's a DENREC quality of the marsh issue, and they will be required to meet DENREC's approval to get that approved. And there's also, if the land on this side of it is draining down through there, you can't block their drainage. Even if you own the property, you can't block your neighbor's drainage. So you either have to accept it and work around, and figure a way to function with their water coming at you, or not develop the property. And trust me, DENREC is not going to make it comfortable or easy. Which I love and hate them for, but it's not going to be a simple process with them if that were to get approved.
Because I think we're also starting to combine, because I think what we're thinking of is the big picture, is what is flooding? All right, I've got flooding coming in, and then how is it being addressed? Because don't forget, when it rains, we've got stormwater management that's supposed to address that. But like Brent just said, is okay, well, it's raining, but then I've got flooding. So my stormwater management's doing what it's supposed to do, but then I got flooding because of where I am, and it's not because the stormwater management is not doing its job. It is. There's multiple components. So I think we're trying to recognize, okay, like Brent said, FEMA said, Louisiana, you got 4 feet of water. That's not a flood because you didn't even get to the base flood elevation is what I'm hearing.
It's just Tuesday.
It's just and I think we see that, and that's what we're working on West Cedar Street. It's like, it could just be a normal day and we get flooding on the street. Okay. That's not because it's not raining. It's not raining that day. It's just because of where we are and what we're surrounded by.
Maryland has a nasty term for that. It's called nuisance.
Nuisance?
Nuisance
flooding.
Yes. And it's, while accurate, I don't think it really carries the weight but the Chesapeake Bay is bigger than the Delaware Bay, and there's more communities throughout. But, well, how are you going to address nuisance flooding?
I think at some point we can control as much as we can, but I don't think we're ever going to be able to stop some of the flooding. Because even with the West Cedar Street, the intent is not to stop the flooding, it's to limit the impacts of the flooding. Because of where we are, we can't stop the flooding, but the intent is to limit the impact of the flooding. And I think that's what we're trying to do here.
And if there's a bigger impact, then to be prepared for it. To know it's coming, because we have a storm surge, we have a nor'easter, we have predictions from the National Weather Service, we have the tide gauges, to be able to understand that we can get people out of harm's way during that. But on the normal Tuesday, when it's high tide, is keep people out of harm's way on those times and make it livable, not nuisance-y.
Right. I think Old Orchard, there's a development, Sussex County. Like Tuesday, it floods, high tide every Tuesday. I don't think it happens, but it floods a lot, and it exists. To them, that's what happens. And it's not because of a neighboring building a development. It's not, I mean, even if a neighborhood builds a development, they're still going to get that flooding every day. So I think we're coming back to, and I think we can do this, is we want no net loss of floodplain, and we want that data showing how they're getting there. But I think we also have to understand is that there might be an individual case, because again, it's the best information possible, that my property is still going to flood because Brent's building a house next door, but it's not Brent's fault. But there might be still flooding that my flooding could increase. And I'm not sure there's a way we can negate that. There are ways to, and again, that's why we have stormwater management. That's why we have, we want to have the no net loss, and the floodplain is to reduce the impacts of flooding. But there might be a day that my house gets more rain than it used to, but it's still not Brent's fault. Does that make sense?
There's so many factors like ground saturation. If you have a week of rain and your ground is saturated, that's going to affect your flood levels. If you have low air pressure, you're going to have a storm surge because of the low air pressure. You're going to have wind direction, lunar cycles, and the tides and everything like this. It's just a tremendous amount of mix that can go in that.
Right. And
I'm really surprised that, knock on wood, spit, that October hasn't been worse around Lewis with king tides occurring, with the moon cycle and everything. And you would think that we've had nor'easters in September and October before, but all the big tides have happened in January, February, and March. Outside of Sandy, everything else has been nor'easters in the wintertime.
Yeah, keep those fingers crossed. Huh?
Yeah,
Yeah.
So
Okay, was there anything else in the Newcastle?
I think it really was just that first one that he wanted us to take a look at. He even directed me to the to one of the FEMA technical documents, and it was broad and generic regarding Phil, because I've read it multiple times now, and Brent's shaking his head. Yep.
Welcome to FEMA.
It's a technical guidance to give you information, but it's very broad. And it was really, it's like, okay, if you're, what it really said is, can't use fill to elevate structures. And that, especially, in the VE for structures. But I think the rest of it is, excuse me, is that, what is, sorry, my email popped and I lost my train of thought. And I didn't even read it. So I think it's just, we're just trying to find that balance with the understanding of, is like, I think flooding is, we see a lot of it, but as Joe has said, there's so many different components. And as Brent has said, it could just be Tuesday, and it's just because, it's rained every day that, you know, we're going to have flooding. But I think, Melanie, your intent is to reduce to the greatest extent possible the impacts of flooding on neighboring properties, correct?
Well, no, we
Oh.
can't do that. I mean, that's clearly not possible. What we don't want is to increase the possibility of flooding on adjacent properties by the subdivision action. Okay. Wasn't there another section of the code where there was a discrepancy or something wasn't, something was contradicting what we were trying to achieve?
It was really, David Warga said it was this one because it conflicts with, because what we've got right now is no net loss of natural floodplain storage or increase in water surface elevations during the base flood. I think we can clean that up and just use the Newcastle County language, which I think everybody liked.
I like our language better.
Okay, well, we've got issues with our language because I've got both Mike Powell and David Warga going, I've never heard of the term floodplain storage capacity.
Well, we agreed that we would modify
Yeah,
that.
we're gonna fix that.
Yeah.
And then
But didn't they point out another section of?
yes, because the fill ordinance appears to conflict with sections E3B of the flood ordinance, which allow up to 1 foot increase in the base flood elevation in areas where the base flood of the with no floodway, which again we don't have. So current code says you can fill up to 1 foot, and I think what we could do is go fix that section of code that says, well, you can't do that for major subdivisions, or you can fill up to 1 foot, but you have to provide the no net loss of natural floodplain storage. So I think we can fix it by adding major subdivisions to E3B. Because I think that's what his concern was, is
Okay.
and I think we can fix it that way. But we're gonna have to and I think we can still ask for the report showing how they got to no net loss, with the understanding that it's going to be different from everybody who does it, right, Brent? Is you can still, an engineer can show me how you got there, but with the understanding that my report is going to look different than Brent's report, it's going to look different than Joe's
Yeah,
report
and
based on
we'll
information.
review it. And at the end of the day, you guys have not approval, but, you know, suggestions moving forward, whether or not you want to accept what they've offered or do better or thank you or.
Right. Okay. Janelle, what I would like to fix in 3B is to delete at the very end where it says more than 1 foot at any point. I think we also get rid of the discrepancy if we eliminate that.
So if we get rid of that, I think we need to start talking to the public now, because that to me is a big red flag, because right now.
Again, it's just for major subdivisions.
So I think we leave it in there and put a caveat that except for major subdivisions, or that subdivisions have to provide no net loss, because because E3B is for every property in the floodplain. It's not specific to major subdivisions. So that's where we need to make sure we're consistent, is that those both reference that where we want the no net loss is in major subdivisions. And
Well,
that we want that documentation as the major subdivision.
I thought that's how we were going to fix B, though, by introducing it as 4 major subdivisions.
Well, right, because if you just turn E3B into just major subdivisions, you've just took out Joe's ability to fill on his property, and he's not a major subdivision. So I think we need to add a line regarding the major subdivisions and referencing back to the fill issue, if that makes sense. They both need to reference at some point a major subdivision, because I think I think you could allow for up to a foot in the floodplain, but you still have to provide a no net loss in the floodplain storage capacity. Because you might actually be able to, and I'm going to look at Brent, I can maybe fill up to a foot, but I can still end up with a no net. I can still end up at a no net loss, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think we
You
add
could
that.
fill more than a foot too.
Well, our code says can't go more than a foot. And I think we just need to make sure that we add to E3B that major subdivisions have to be at a no net loss. Or do you just want to say they can't fill at all? But then that gets into the road issue Brent has talked about, because if we build a road.
I don't want to say that. I don't want to say that.
I was just asking.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Could we split this so that we have a statement for individual homes?
Yes, I think we can.
And then a major subdivisions where they're subject to the no net loss.
Yep. Yeah, I think we just add a line.
More than 1 foot doesn't really matter.
Right. D5. So I think I can add that. I'll get that circulate back out to everybody, that we're just going to add a line. I'm going to clean up D5D, which is the fill. And I'm just going to say that we're going to require the report, and then I think I'm going to lose the last line where it says the report shall include the existing and proposed flood storage capacity, because that's what they said. They don't know what it is, but if we're asking the report to provide, they're going to have to show us how they got to no net loss. So is that okay? Because we're already asking them to provide a report showing how they got to no net loss.
My head is spinning right now. So
Okay.
I think you need to do your stuff and we'll review it.
Okay. I will take a shot at this. Would you guys like to get back together in a couple of weeks to discuss it? And I apologize. I don't think Mr. Warger just wasn't available to make it. He might have gotten caught up in something else, because he was planning on attending. So he might have just gotten caught up with something else today.
Well, it's really disappointing that we don't have his input.
Same thing with Robin. He never showed either.
I think he was in and out. So, and
Oh.
then we just didn't call on him again.
Okay.
So 2 weeks would be June 4th?
No.
Nope.
My birthday. My birthday. We have visitors.
Oh, okay. Is the week of the 31st good? Except for, of course, the 31st. Or is that just a bad week?
Of July or June?
June. Oh, I'm just looking 2 weeks out.
There's no 31st in June.
31st of May goes
May.
into the first week of June.
So June 1st, 2nd, or 3rd? Because the 4th is out. Joe's got company.
Yeah.
First or second are good.
Thursday, the 3rd is good. I have H Park at 6 p.m. so I could do a morning Zoom.
Okay.
On the
Melanie,
That's good.
morning. Brent,
I'm tied up from like 10:30 to 12.
Okay.
31st is a holiday. That's okay.
Wednesday the 2nd in the morning?
That's okay for me.
I've got mitigation group.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mayor's
but
Day.
if we do like 11
Okay,
on the 2nd,
okay.
Joe?
As long as you bump the mayor off, yeah.
I'm not gonna bump the mayor, but they're usually done by 11 if they're starting at 9. So, okay, I will get these changes out to those sections of code, send them to you guys, and then we can discuss on the 2nd.
Great.
All right,
11 a.m.
everybody have a wonderful day.
You too.
Okay, thank you. Bye now.